Hello, this is Virtualis the Chess Noob, learning and having fun with chess. One of the strategies that I've learned in the last year of beginner chess is knowing what to do when materially ahead. Sometimes in the opening or in the mid-game, I'll be fortunate enough to be up a piece of material, usually a knight or bishop. In this situation, rather than trying to create opportunities for a clever checkmate, it may be simpler and safer to try to liquidate the board. That is, make or force balanced material trades to push the game towards an endgame where you retain that piece advantage. This game is an example where I was able to put this into practice. Please enjoy! So let's start with the review. So this is chess.com's algorithm, and my opponent started the opening well. They opened with the London, which I am not as familiar with, and so they were quite a bit ahead. But then sort of towards the middle game, they made an error, and I came out ahead. I sort of played with pretty good accuracy, I think, almost 89% accuracy. There was one blunder, which is here, but luckily that blunder wasn't a critical error on my part. All right, so moving on to analysis. The opponent played white, I played black, and as mentioned, they played the London system. So d4, I responded with d5, bishop f4, and here I would normally play knight f6. Knight f3, bishop f5, so very symmetrical at this point in time, e3, e6. They play c3, and here I actually thought for a while before making the next move. I wasn't entirely sure what would be the best move. I seem to have recollections from previous games and analyses that bishop to d6 might be good, but I didn't really want to, lose my bishop pair. So instead, I ended up playing, I think, knight to h5. The idea here, putting putting pressure onto the opponent's dark square bishop now that it's sort of now blocked in by the pawn. And I thought in this position, no matter where the opponent went, it would be relatively good for me. Now, it's interesting that Stockfish is okay with this, but it didn't really like my next series of moves. So I thought this move, f6, was good. Again, putting pressure onto the bishop, and obviously I need to block the diagonal given that it is attacking my queen. And also I thought that that pawn potentially restricts the mobility of their knight, and potentially allowing for a creation of a sort of a chain of pawns supporting a center push. So I thought that was a pretty good move. So interesting enough that that Stockfish didn't like it. So they moved the way that I expected them to move, and then I played g5, again, an inaccuracy according to Stockfish. And I think the rationale here is that the opponent could potentially capture that pawn with knight, which opens up the diagonal for the queen, which comes with check. So that's the reason why it's not good. And in fact, that's actually what happened. So I captured the knight back. They capture my knight. Here I block with bishop. Again, opponent potentially quite a bit ahead now from that opening. And that was, I have to admit, that was a little bit unexpected for me. I thought this was actually okay for me, but clearly with ideal play, this is actually quite good for white. They capture the pawn, the second pawn. Here I decide to trade queens. And the opponent is now, I think, up effectively 2 points of material. However, I have, let's see the balance. So we still both have both bishops. knight, yeah. So I effectively have lost a couple of pawns, and the opponent is better developed, especially with their pawn structure. I bring out my knight, sort of looking at potentially doing long castles. They push h4, which was apparently a good move. Here I decide to threaten the bishop with h6. And here the opponent makes a massive blunder with h5. And the reason for that is that pawn doesn't actually attack that bishop. Now, I actually didn't see this during the actual game, but the best move here is for pawn to capture bishop, and the opponent cannot capture back without hanging their rook. So this was actually a fairly serious blunder for the opponent. Now I blunder right back. I didn't see that transformation. I played the next move fairly quickly, so I thought, need to move the bishop. Let's try to keep material balance. I just thought, let's just whack that knight. So I whacked that knight. They captured back. I thought that was potentially okay, given that now that means that the opponent can no longer castle on that side, which was what looked like they were going to do. And with that capture back, I now have the opportunity to capture the bishop as well. So now I am actually up a piece. So both rooks, one and two minor pieces. The opponent only has the two rooks and one bishop. So I am one piece up. Even though I'm down a couple of pawns, I am now one piece up. And at this point, my goal was basically to try to force trades in pieces because I thought, with the better pawn structure, if the opponent keeps their pieces, they probably have pretty good counterplay, while if I'm able to trade off the pieces, force and move towards an endgame, it would probably be winning for me, or at least much easier to play, easier to win. Opponent pushes a pawn, which was good. That was better because that would have pinned the knight to the queen, though in a certain sense it doesn't make a lot of difference given that long castles is coming. However, what I chose was to bring the knight forward to f6, and my goal here was to capture the pawn with rook. So firstly capturing a pawn, also then inviting a trade of rooks. The opponent could move the rook to g1, but now they can no longer be able to castle on either side, and also the rook on g1 is probably not a very good position for that rook. Opponent pushes another pawn, f3, and with their pawn majority, this is what they need to do actually. They need to bring their pawns forward to try to overwhelm my pawns. However, now I'm able to capture the pawn with rook. Rook captures rook, knight captures rook back. So now very happy, traded off one of their rooks. So now they only have one rook, one bishop, two minor pieces and a rook. And proportionally, this is much better for me than still having each having an additional rook. Push a pawn forward, bring the knight back to f6, bishop to d3. That sort of makes sense. Potentially there's a check there. Now long castles, bringing my other rook into the game. Opponent plays a4. So yep, pushing their pawns forward. So they do have a pawn majority. So I have 6 pawns. I think they've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep, they still have 7 pawns. Let's go. So I now bring bishop to d6. So my goal is, again, trying to maybe break into the center. Play b5, which is okay. At this point, I was thinking that it would probably be important for me to block that. However, I opted to play more aggressively and immediately, not that, immediately try to break into the center, I think. Yep. So e5. So it looks like, according to Stockfish, this was a better move, but both moves, I'm still in a winning position. So captures, and I was very happy with this potential fork. Oh, hold on, it's not a fork yet, is it? Yeah, but I certainly have an attack on that pawn, which comes with check. So opponent forced to move their rook to protect the pawn. Now I bring my knight back, seeing a potential fork here. Opponent tries to pin. the knight to the king, which is a good move. However, I can simply sidestep that by king b8. Pawn move, that was probably not the best move, I think, for the opponent, because now I've got knight, so again threatening the rook. Rook moves to a3, which makes sense. Captures, opening up the file now for the rook. Captures back, and now I've got an opportunity to capture. And that's what I want. I want to trade pieces. This also splits those 3 pawns as well, which is good for me in the endgame. And again, trying to create an opportunity to encourage a trade. No, but they don't play, which is fine because now I can capture that pawn. And this is one of the things, when you're up a piece in the endgame, it often doesn't matter that the opponent has a pawn advantage. You can often just use your pieces to capture those excess pawns. Now, never too late to hang a back rank mate, so I need to create a pocket for myself. That's fine. And here, my goal is again to try to trade off that rook, to try to find an opportunity where I can do that. So move that there. Potentially, if they don't move the rook, the king and the rook will be forked, forcing a trade. And that's what happens. They opted to move a pawn rather than move their rook out of the way. So check. Now the king and rook are forked, have to capture, and now the opponent has no more pieces, only pawns, and I have a bishop. So this is completely winning for me, though of course you still have to transform it. Yep, and here to prevent that move from occurring, I'm going to move my own pawn to a6. And from this point, it was really a matter of shuffling. So this pawn's trying to promote, but basically it's just not fast enough. Yep. And this king will be sort of the only logical thing is to try to capture that pawn, but this means my king can capture those remaining pawns. And that's basically what happens. A few sort of shuffling moves with them trying to go after my bishop. That doesn't make any sense. And now with the king, the king basically has like a force field, so the kings cannot be within 1 square of each other, and so the force field from my king means that this pawn cannot be stopped from being promoted. And after this point, it's really a matter of shuffling, trying to aim to get to a checkmate. The most important thing for me at this point is to not accidentally cause a stalemate, which can sometimes occur if the bishop is in and around sort of the king as well. Now I'm not so great with seeing all the checkmates. So I'm really much more concerned with potentially missing a stalemate. So my goal here was just to move the bishop out of the way and then just aim for a checkmate with king and queen. And so aiming to stay, so the L, so 1 knight's move away from the king, bringing the sort of king into the picture to try to force the opponent king onto the side of the board. There we go. So now must move in that direction. Yep. Stay with the L. King. Yep. King down. Forcing the king now onto the side. Queen now traps the king on that single rank or single file, and now moving the king so that there's opposition. And the idea is no matter where the king moves now, it's checkmate. So good game from opponent. GG. As there are fewer and fewer pieces left on the board, the absolute difference in material becomes proportionately more significant. Being up a piece in the endgame, even when the opponent has a pawn majority, is often winning. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.